All right, let's jump right in. We all saw it happen, right? Practically overnight, remote work went from being this rare, cool perk for maybe 5% of the workforce to the standard operating model for millions of us. But here's the thing. With that massive shift, we brought along some pretty huge assumptions about what actually makes a distributed team successful. We kind of just thought, hey, hand someone a laptop, tell them to work from home, and boom, instant modern productivity. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to totally unpack the actual science behind distributed team success.
So, is more autonomy always better for remote teams? I mean, we all had that fantasy, right? Typing away on a beach, no boss hovering, just total unrestricted freedom. It sounds absolutely amazing. No one looking over your shoulder, you totally control your schedule. We just naturally assume that giving people more autonomy automatically equals a happier and more productive team. But as we're going to see today, that default assumption, it's actually a massive trap. What if I told you that too much freedom could literally be just as damaging as too little?
To figure this out, here's our agenda for today. First, the remote autonomy myth. Then, we'll hit the autonomy sweet spot, followed by manager role clarity matters, the media richness approach, and finally, designing distributed team success. All right, starting off with section 1, the remote autonomy myth.
When remote work blew up, it brought this unexpected and honestly pretty dangerous myth with it. The idea that autonomy is just this simple straight line where more is always better. Now, obviously, we know that too little autonomy leads to micromanagement, right? Constant monitoring, zero freedom, it just breeds massive stress. But the research actually reveals something totally wild on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Absolute freedom actually causes coordination failure. Picture a developer given this huge, vague project and literally zero check-ins. Without a clear framework, workers in that exact situation report feeling intensely isolated, their work gets totally fragmented, and they just feel overwhelmed by all that responsibility. So total autonomy isn't paradise. Without structure, it's just chaos. That's exactly why treating async work as a deliberate design choice is absolutely crucial to preventing that coordination failure.
Moving right along to section 2, the autonomy sweet spot. Okay, so if extreme micromanagement and extreme freedom are both total fails, where does that leave us? Well, the data shows this amazing thing researchers call a curvilinear effect. Basically, it's an inverted U-shape. If you look right at that middle peak, that is the Goldilocks zone. When managers provide just a moderate amount of autonomy, their perceived effectiveness absolutely skyrockets. They hit that sweet spot where teams really thrive. The huge takeaway here is that autonomy actually has a curvilinear effect on effectiveness. It perfectly balances the freedom you need to execute with the guidance you need to stay totally aligned. And get this, a completely separate diary study tracking 150 workers proves this exact same curve applies to our daily routines. We're not just talking about how you view your boss anymore. This is about how your team actually functions on a day-to-day basis. As daily perceived autonomy gets too high, teamwork literally drops off a cliff. The coordination totally fails because everyone just starts operating in their own completely separate silos. That brings us to section 3, manager role clarity matters. So if giving too much autonomy is basically pushing your team off a cliff, what can leaders actually do to stop that? I want you to think about it like a high-speed highway. Autonomy is the speed, right? We definitely want our teams moving fast and staying agile, but driving incredibly fast on a winding mountain road with zero guardrails, that is terrifying. The essential guardrail we need here is manager role clarity, because manager role clarity actually dictates exactly how much autonomy a team can safely handle. When expectations, goals, and responsibilities are crystal clear, teams can cruise independently without crashing into coordination failure. Check out how the dotted line representing high role clarity just flattens out on the right side of this graph. It totally avoids that steep, scary dive. This proves that a manager who sets crystal clear expectations literally protects their team from the total chaos of high autonomy. When role clarity is high, you can actually afford to give your team way more freedom because you've provided this solid structural anchor that prevents all that ambiguity and isolation. Let's dive into section 4, the media richness approach. When you're on a distributed team, your communication tools literally are your workplace. Which brings us to a massively important concept for modern remote work, matching the message to the medium. Have you ever tried to hash out a really complex, emotionally charged debate over a chaotic Slack thread? Yeah, it almost always spirals totally out of control, because text just isn't rich enough for that kind of message. To maintain relationships, we need what researchers call multimodal media richness. By using a multimodal approach, meaning you deliberately mix text, audio, and video where it actually makes sense, you're doing the absolute most to reduce remote work isolation and keep those highway guardrails completely intact. Now, the research shows us something pretty counterintuitive. Relying on a purely synchronous culture, where everyone is expected to be on Zoom all day or responding to pings in 3 seconds flat, that actually destroys coordination. Synchronous cultures force these constant interruptions and brutal context switching, which completely shatters that autonomy curve we just looked at. Instead, top-performing teams perfectly explain why an async-first approach is a deliberate operating model that scales so much better than synchronous cultures. They'll use email or shared docs for straightforward tasks, which fiercely protects deep work. Then they reserve rich media like a Zoom call strictly for complex relational stuff. Async just scales better. It lets people collaborate on huge projects without needing perfectly overlapping schedules, which slashes burnout and seriously boosts actual productivity. Finally, Section 5, Designing Distributed Team Success.
All right, here is your literal blueprint for the boundary conditions of remote success. First up, you have to establish clear communication norms. Ditch those chaotic synchronous demands and build a really deliberate async-first design. Second, provide those structural guardrails by delivering absolute manager role clarity. Third, use rich media strategically. Please don't just default to video for every single thing. Match the medium to the message to cut down on isolation. And lastly, empower communication autonomy. You see, effective distributed work isn't just a happy accident of sending people home. Choosing async is a highly deliberate design choice that straight up prevents coordination failure.
The research leaves us with this incredible quote: "The success of digital management is not a one-size-fits-all endeavor." And that matters so much, because you cannot just set and forget your team's workflow. Managers have to actively and continually adapt to their specific team's evolving needs, giving them just that perfect mix of freedom and structure. So, total autonomy isn't some magic silver bullet, and communication isn't just about talking louder or more often. It's all about structure. Which leaves me with one big question for you. How will you deliberately design your digital guardrails today? Take a hard look at your team's communication channels and the clarity of your expectations. Ask yourself, are you building a highway that's actually safe to speed on? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.